I think to get things kicked off, maybe just give everyone a little bit of context around your work at MuleSoft.
Yeah, sure. I'll preface it with just a tiny thing about my own personal history.
Oh, sure.
So I've been at MuleSoft for 5.5 years. Before that, I ran the Nook Cloud for Barnes & Noble. So that was my only other exposure to a public company. And before that, I think I did 6 different startups. Some I started, some I joined, and many of them were in the enterprise space. And then before that, I did many years as a theoretical physicist, which I like to think prepared me for the world of integration, because it is craziness. And so at MuleSoft, I think, you know, the driving, I mean, the problem is that software needs to talk to each other, right? That's the world of integration, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But the thing that we really wanted to solve when I joined is, how do we not become the glue that sticks all these pieces together and freezes enterprises in place and doesn't allow them to actually evolve? Because what you do when you do these big integration projects is you have to then tear them all apart later when things change. So how do we both make applications connect to each other, but do it in such a way that you can change it later? That was kind of the big problem to solve.
Oh, interesting. Cool. I mean, so I think just for everyone else's information too, like let's dive into a little bit like why enterprises focus on integrations is such a key, you know, factor when they're evaluating different applications.
Yeah, it gets to a little bit of actually what Eugenia was saying, right? The heterogeneity and the complexity that you have inside of enterprises is huge. But one way that it reflects it is that there are numerous systems. And so instead of thinking about just, you know, what is it that I should integrate with, you really have to get into this mode of, how can I become integrable, right? How can I make myself, set myself up for the point where I'm going to need to talk to 15 different systems that I've never heard of before, because some of them were written before I was born and others have just come on the scene. That's kind of the landscape of enterprise integrations.
Cool. And I know you prepared some slides, because there's this concept of interoperability, which is a word, and
it is a thing.
And you know, and sort of how that compares to integrations. And
yeah.
So I think you brought some slides to help kind of like describe that process.
You have to put yourself a little bit in the mind of the customer, right? The customer is somebody inside of the enterprise, and unless you are indeed selling to, you know, a 5-person team that really could be at an enterprise or not, mostly you're selling to somebody who's kind of deep inside the enterprise, lives somewhere under, say, the CIO or the CTO. And it's very important to put yourself in the head of that person, right? So that person is faced with, for example, just inside of marketing, and just inside of the SEO part of marketing, there's something like, and this is a couple of years old, 100 different companies pitching different things. The picture behind that, what that actually shows you is that that's part of 3,500 different companies that this group is tracking just for marketing automation. And you would think, well, that's not a big deal. I'll just take the top 10 and those are the ones that I evolved. But it doesn't work that way. These are hyper-specialized. They're really good at one particular thing. And if you don't take that approach of adopting lots and lots of these things, then you're going to be behind on each one of these aspects. So in that hyper-complicated world, what do you actually do? You have to be able to, as a CIO, you have to be able to get good at piecing these things together. That's the world in which you're in. And so we'll see what the next slide does. But you know, the idea is that the world that you're facing when you're coming into this world is not this very nice puzzle block of everything kind of fits together and you just have to slot it in the right place. It's a whole bunch of systems that were built over time with all sorts of integrations between them. And then there's all the shadow IT and the mobile and the SaaS world that puts things outside of the enterprise control. And so from a CIO's perspective, it's like, my God, I can hardly keep up with what I'm asked to do today. How can I possibly adopt your new software that you're selling me? That's the mindset that they're coming in with, right? That's the challenge that they have to solve. And their career depends on it. I think at some point we saw that the average tenure of a CIO is 2 years. Because they can't solve this and they always blame the previous person. So how do you actually get ready for that kind of landscape? You have to think of where that landscape came from. And the build that this was going to do is, the way that this happens is incrementally, right? So it's not as though somebody meant to create a big spaghetti block. They just built it project by project, integrated this in, wrote some custom code, integrated this in, bought an SI with 5,000 custom developers, did a bunch of stuff, and you end up with this thing over time, like the old boiling the frog thing, right?
Sure.
It just kind of happens under your watch. And so what we wanted to figure out is there a different approach, right? And then we would build software for it that allowed you to not get into this kind of state. And the idea here is, again, it's not building out, but what you do is, you don't just connect with custom code all your applications. You expose an API, and then you connect to that API, as if you're building a new application. So that thing that connects them is itself an application. It's a tiny one. It's what we would all call glue code. But that thing is now productized, right? So now you've got 3 different pieces that glue things together, but they should be regarded as applications. They have an SDLC, they're well managed, they're exposed. And it turns out that because they sit on top of APIs, when you go and change those things, it's very easy to do, because those APIs are really products. So it's a different mentality, but it brings to the forefront that integration is really a problem of productizing APIs and then building on top of them. And that creates new structures, and you build on top of those. And it's that motion that gets rid of some of that complexity. It's those levels of abstraction. I'll skip past this, and you end up with something that we call an application network. So think about your computers at home. You don't sit there and say, well, what bits should I be sending, and what wires should I buy to send them? So no, it's Cat5, or it's Wi-Fi, and it's over standard protocols, and everything is kind of plug and play. How do you get to that state for applications? That's the world of integration.
How should a application vendor, right, think about entering that world, right? So this is the perspective of the enterprise. You know, if I'm a vendor who's building, you know, one of these, you know, small pieces,
yeah,
like what should I be really focused on?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because if you start to take upon your problem, what other software do I need to integrate with in order to have a coherent offering, which is always the case. Well, there's lots of software, and it all changes all the time. So you end up with a never-winning race of integrating with everything, and then every customer will want you to do it a little bit differently. I think the only approach that I've seen works is figure out what is it that you actually do. What is your value proposition? What thing do you actually do? And model that in the cleanest way possible. Stripe, I think, has been a great example of that, right? If you want to do payments, this is the way that you want to describe payments, in the simplest possible way, and productize that API. Once you've done that, if you want, you can then build pre-built integrations to that simple model, but that model is unlikely to be changing all over the map, because it's a very clean way to actually expose payments. And so it's likely to not have to change very quickly. The integrations can change quickly, but the integrations attach to something that is very easy to understand, so it's easy to actually build and change them later. So that's what I mean by interoperability, is expose yourself as this clean, simple model. It's then easy for people to put it together again.
And so, you know, you focus on sort of API creation and interoperability, and should you build any specific integrations, you know, like into a system of record, whatever that might be? Some people say Salesforce is like the system of record for a lot of these applications. Like, should you build specific, or should you just have an integration, like an integrable API, or should you build into an integration platform? Like, what's the best approach?
So obviously you should use an integration platform.
Well, sure. That makes, yeah.
But I think the key is that you should separate out the 2 problems. One is, have I made myself integrable? Have I exposed? Have I thought through what's my value prop and so on? How do I expose that? Let's say that that's done. Now you go to market and you say, what friction are my customers going to encounter? And if they want, you know, if they're always going to be integrating with 2 or 3 things, then I want to also provide those out of the box, sitting on top of my APIs. Not pre-built in, not backwires, nothing else. Sure. I sit on top of that. Ideally, you would use a platform for doing that, because why should you have to reinvent that wheel? Know that when your customers go there, they might be perfectly happy with those integrations, or they might say, I've got an integration platform, I'm going to hook directly into your APIs and do it the way that makes sense for me, and that should be fine.
So if you are working with like an integration platform and doing that in a more abstracted way, like how do you avoid that like least common denominator problem, or how do you like really, you know, get that special feature that one, you know, like that one API only has? Like how do you build out around that?
Yeah, I think there's probably, you know, for those who haven't been in the integration space, there's an assumption that what an integration platform does, it has pre-built connectors for everything, and therefore, if you're not going to build literally a connector for every software system, it can only do the lowest common denominator. That's not how we look at the world, and I'm thinking that other integration platforms are not looking at that anymore. But rather, you actually look at the API specification that is exposed. That will have all the richness of that company, because there's literally no other way to interact with that company other than through their API. Their API has all of their capabilities. You read that API spec and you make it very simple for people to connect to all the rich capabilities of that in a way that doesn't involve a lot of custom code. So it's more that the integration platform should fit itself to any software that it finds out there, versus that it has to, you know, lower the bar for all the other software so you can talk to it.
How do you think, so there's a fairly technical audience, right? And I think that they, probably many are re-architected or have re-architected their applications to use GraphQL as part of their API. And so how does that change this landscape, and how do you think that fits in the future?
Yeah, I think GraphQL, I have lots of answers for that because it's a really interesting topic, but in particular, I think it's actually an illustration of what we talked about before in terms of interoperability, right? So I think the driver for GraphQL, if you look at its origins in Facebook, it's like, I'm a mobile developer, I need a bunch of information, it comes from a bunch of sort of logical tables, but I only need this particular combination of that information. I don't want all the rest of that stuff for any number of reasons. And I don't know that stuff in advance, and it's going to change twice a day, so how can you basically let me query for exactly the information I want, and you on the server take care of serving that up for me? And the GraphQL solution for that is that you have to write these resolvers on the server in order to actually serve the right information, and the GraphQL server will put it all together. Which means that you have to anticipate in advance and code for all of the things that the user might actually want. So I think we're answering a very, very valid request of an application to go and decide what information it wants with a very siloed approach of I'm going to have to anticipate all that and write it all myself. So I think we need to answer that, but we need to answer that in such a way that it actually scales. In other words, that it goes across lots of APIs. So what we've been working towards is how can we take a GraphQL query, an extended GraphQL query, and automatically federate it across a whole bunch of RESTful APIs, because REST has solved a lot of the individual problems, but what the user is asking for is please aggregate them for me. And if we can do that in an automated way, we get rid of yet more glue code that tries to anticipate how to put all of that together, and we let developers expose their functionalities as RESTful APIs, and we let consumers consume that through GraphQL. I think we can get best of both worlds.
I think probably an important point here is you talk about MuleSoft and what you guys are doing. It's not just the product. It's also you have open source specs and other things that you've kind of been developing in order to help facilitate this move for the world, right? It's not just buy and enter the platform, but it's try to find the common open source way to do this, right?
Yeah, it's not just open source, it's also about open protocols, right? So just like Eugenio mentioned, if there's a standard way to do things, please let's all fall behind that standard. And if there isn't a standard, maybe we should create some standards so that we don't have to be recreating this stuff. And so as much as possible, we've tried to create standards, promote standards, open source some of the pieces that we think are really important for the ecosystem to have, so it's easier to connect to each other. And I remember at the beginning, people were saying, well, if you make integration so easy, you guys are going to be out of a job. I'm like, don't worry. There is so much work out there for integrating stuff that we'd much rather kind of write on top of that than have to write a lot of glue code.
Cool. So one of the concepts, the foundational concepts of enterprise ready is this concept of product assortment, which is basically how do you offer different features and feature gate in order to charge your enterprise customers more money, right? And to sort of segregate who needs to be paying more and who needs different features and keep simple versions for your startup customers. So do you think that API access, right? Do you think that is a feature that these vendors should think about using as a feature to differentiate different pricing plans?
I think API access should be, the access itself is not an add-on. I think it should be in fact favored. I think you get a tremendous amount of adoption and pull and developer love by telling developers, use my capabilities. You may or may not choose to use my UI. Obviously, it depends on your business.
Sure.
But if you're exposing core capabilities, make them as consumable as possible. And I think these days, consumption means APIs, right? If the end result is that the APIs are hard, you have to pay for them and so on, I think it will actually limit your adoption more than anything. I'm not saying don't monetize the APIs in the sense of if this is the way that you're consuming your service, of course you should monetize them. But it shouldn't be as a friction point to generate more money. It should be an adoption point to generate more demand.
So I agree, but at the same time, I use the what's going on in the industry, right? It's like Salesforce. You have the $25 a month plan and then the $75 a month plan. And the $25 a month plan doesn't have access to the API. The $75 a month plan per user does at an add-on, and then you get it at the higher level. So seems maybe it works at Salesforce.
We just got acquired. Give us some time.
Okay. So maybe someday that API access.
I'm not saying anything.
Okay.
But,
Okay. I get it. Cool. So another area where these kind of overlap, intertwine is in security, right? And so, Ariana's going to dive into security more broadly in a bit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about how to think about security when it comes to APIs and integrations.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I love that we had the talk on Auth0 before this. So security is one of those things that I didn't have a chance to put it up on these slides, but it's one of those things that you walk into an enterprise, and if you're not ready on the security part, get ready for a very, very grueling experience, right? The higher up you go. Again, it may not matter the first 2 or 3 users that come in, but as soon as this gets adoption, and you're all eager to jump in and so on, the security is going to be a big deal. The landscape on security today is such that you probably don't even know when you're getting breached, right? It's already happening, right? And you will find out about it at kind of the worst possible time when the bandits are not only across the gate, they've taken everything and they're somewhere away, and they're now offering it for sale. So it's the kind of thing that you really have to think about sort of at the design phase. And I think actually the API approach gives you the structure to make something very secure. In other words, it's much more securable. And that's because you've declared your points of integration. You can't just hook into your database and have backends and so on. These are products. The products have security built into them. The only way into your stuff is through that product. And it's monitorable and it's well-defined. There's no secrets out there. If you try to hide that, and I've got a lot of IoT stuff at home, and it always says, well, you know, we don't publish the protocols to talk to it. The only people who know it are the hackers, right? The security people don't know, your company doesn't know. So publish that stuff, make it very, very explicit, and then secure it layer by layer, and we can talk more about how.
So your perspective there is like an API-driven company will actually be more security oriented because the interfaces that if they're API first, then their interfaces are going to be secured by default versus like making calls in database.
By far, the integrations will happen. If you don't productize those integrations, that's where they'll come in.
You know, on the same vein of like other enterprise-ready features, right? I'm sure, you know, at MuleSoft, you're also someone who offers enterprise software, so
Yep.
it's not like you just do integrations. So, you know, like so within your product itself, are there any specific enterprise-ready type features that you think have been super helpful or were most interesting to your enterprise customers?
Yeah. So I guess there's kind of two kinds, right? One is there's a list of things you need to do. I think you guys have them on your site. Auth0 was a great example. There are a number of other things that if you're already doing them, it's much easier to be absorbed into that enterprise, right? Are you doing logging in such a way that they can aggregate into a dashboard? Are you producing audit logs that they can use for auditing? And depending on the industry, there's a number of things that you want to have checked off. The other part is sort of the structure and the deployment model and the way you kind of are anticipating where the future is, right? So, for example, if you have software that's running in the cloud, this may or may not be as relevant, but if you have software that runs on-prem, and much of our software runs on-prem as well as in the cloud, how ready are you to be deployed into a Kubernetes cluster? Mm-hmm. That may not be relevant for 80% of your customers, but that will change in the next couple of years. So are you already getting ready for that? And you might say, well, why should I do it now? Well, because the customers that have the deepest pockets are the ones that are also already playing with that stuff. And so you kind of want to tell them, you're not going to make a mistake for me. So there's these structural things that you're already ready for where things are going, like OpenID Connect, for example. And then there are the sort of hygienic pieces that you really want to be doing. When I joined, I actually built our first InfoSec group, right? And we became PCI compliant pretty quickly. And that's a little bit odd because we don't store credit card information. Why should we do that? But that was a mechanism to get us ready in terms of security posture for when we actually expand, that we've already got all the checks and controls necessary that enterprise will look at it. And so sure enough, when we got bigger and they look at the PCI and other kind of ISO 27001 and so on that we already had, they're like, you know what? The InfoSec conversation goes from a big barrier at the time you want to sell to something where the InfoSec guys are kind of rooting for you. I want those guys because they already, passed all those requirements.
That's amazing advice. I think I'm getting the signal. We've only got a little more time. So, is there any kind of last advice you think you want to give to the audience in terms of their applications are out there trying to get adopted in the enterprise? Like, how should they be thinking about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we lose sight of sometimes as technologists is there's actually a person on the other side making this decision. And understand that person, right? Walk in being able to talk to that person, right? It's like, again, like Eugenie was saying, if you don't know the terminology, if you don't know the kinds of things, if you don't know a little bit of older stuff, it's hard to build a lot of faith in that conversation. So understand a little bit the world of your customer, understand where they've been, and then connect it to their concerns, right? Are they thinking about agility? Are they thinking about security right now? Is there some particular functionality that they're worried about? What is their pain? If you solve one of those pains, you're much, much more likely to get some urgency. Otherwise, you can have great conversations for 2 years and no actual buying happens. So figure out what that point of urgency is in understanding your customer, and then try to leverage into that and be ready to pivot, right? God knows we've pivoted as a company. And some of those pivots turned out to be pretty good.
Uri, thank you so much.
My
This
pleasure.
is amazing.
Thank
Incredible.
you. Thanks, everyone.